Merritt, I have wanted to talk to you for quite a while. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you.
Likewise. I always like to start with every guest with getting some background context as to the story that brings somebody like yourself to a level of expertise and knowledge to have a conversation like this. And I know in doing research for this conversation, I believe you were born and raised in Buffalo, or at least you spent some of your time in Buffalo. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is about 90 miles from there. I lived in Buffalo, in Amherst, for a couple of years. Were you always interested in science and medicine? What do you remember from your early years that, if anything, resonates for the trajectory you ended up taking in your own personal career?
Yeah, I grew up in Amherst, New York, right near Buffalo, and my father was an immunologist, a scientist, and he always had, our house was filled with his grad students, his postdocs. Back then they would, write papers by hand, and his correcting their papers. So I really grew up kind of surrounded by science. And I actually wrote in my high school yearbook that I wanted to be a neurologist. So it's there in print. I don't really remember that, but it's there. But I've loved kind of science since I can remember.
And was immunology always of interest to you? Was that something that you always believed you were destined to follow in your family's footsteps? Was that something that came naturally for you? What do you remember about that time period in that regard?
I remember always wanting to be a scientist, to try to discover something. And I actually never thought I would be a physician. I was really thinking more, again, what I was seeing of being in the lab and trying to discover new things. But then in medical school, I fell in love with seeing patients, and really saw other types of scientists and clinicians who could do both, who could see patients, study patients, develop treatments for people, and work with the lab-based scientists. But that really didn't come until I was actually in medical school and had some experience seeing people living with different illnesses.
Yeah. I know today's conversation is going to focus on one specific human ailment, one that has, I think, personally just fascinated and horrified and terrified me for probably decades, ever since I learned the specifics about it. Do you remember for yourself when you began to learn about ALS specifically? And if you do remember that, that moment for yourself, what do you remember, feeling, thinking about ALS as you began to learn the specifics of what it really is?
Yeah, it was during my residency. So that's after medical school, when I was training to be a neurologist. It was in the early 1990s. And all people could talk about was the discovery of the first gene that caused, the genetic form of ALS, a gene called SOD1. So it was discovered by one of the faculty at Mass General, Dr. Robert Brown. And at the same time, the first gene that could cause a familial form of Alzheimer's was discovered, and also the gene for Huntington's disease. It was really kind of the beginning of the genetic revolution, where you could find these genes that were causing illnesses. And I remember as a young resident seeing people with those illnesses and thinking, wow, finally, maybe there's something we can do about it. And this is what I want to do. It really wasn't until I was a fellow, when I started to train in ALS and these other neurodegenerative diseases, that I met my first patient, with ALS that I took care of, Susan. And I just fell head over heels, for her, as well as for helping this population of people with this awful illness, but for which, I think there's much, much more hope now for effective treatments.
Yeah. And, for myself, I think my first exposure to the disease was reading Tuesdays with Morrie, which I think is, kind of popularized the details of what it's like to watch a man go through ALS as he gets older. And, in the past couple of days, as I've been preparing for this, I've been watching additional videos of people who are struggling with this. I watched the documentary Gleason when I was living in San Francisco, and it's difficult to watch that and not be moved by just the human tragedy that you're witnessing in front of you of a person who is psychologically fully intact oftentimes, and their body is just deteriorating in front of your eyes. For you, when you met Susan, what do you remember about that experience of getting to know her? And what did you witness happen to her body as it began to deteriorate?
Yeah, I mean, I want to, before I describe Susan, I'll just say I feel what you're feeling when you watch those movies or you meet people, that it's an illness that hits people in the prime of their lives, and they're so strong people, and to lose the ability to move any of your muscles is just horrifying. But I'm always struck by the inner strength of people, of how they can adapt to something that seems so difficult, and how they think about others. And Susan was just like that. She was a teacher, and she had a young son who was around 7 or 8 years old at that time. And for her, it was about trying to keep as normal life for him and within her husband, and not to make every day about ALS.
Yeah.
And she had a rapid form of the illness. But I remember her. She really taught me about how important it was to maintain quality of life, to be proactive and to try to get ahead of the symptoms, but also to try to have not every day defined by the illness. And she managed it, and she gave me permission to talk about her. She chose to go on the ventilator so she could be here longer and help take care of her son and her family. And that was also a sacrifice, but one that she did with a lot of dignity. But I think I learned so much from just taking care of one person about the illness, and how to be a good physician, and how to integrate research in clinical care, so that we're learning from everybody, so that we can get rid of this illness finally.
For people who are listening to this that know essentially nothing about ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, how do you describe that to an average citizen who comes and asks you that question? What exactly are we talking about here?
Sure. So I'll start by what it stands for is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. It's also known as motor neuron disease, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and it's an illness where the motor nerves, which are the nerves that go to your muscles and help you move, they start to degenerate, or they start to die. And when they're not working well, you can't move your muscles. And so that includes your muscles in your hands or your feet, or your speaking or breathing or swallowing, really everything that we take for granted every day. And it's a progressive illness where maybe someone will start with a little weakness in their foot. Maybe they're tripping on their foot, to eventually not being able to walk at all. It's usually people's mind is really intact. So their thoughts, their memory, their cognition and their feelings are intact. It's just that they don't have the ability to move their muscles.
You just mentioned some, but what are generally speaking, what tend to be the most common symptoms that might portend a problem here? What do people begin to experience that may require them to come and seek medical counsel to see if there's really something wrong?
Most common symptom is weakness. So maybe, and it tends to happen in what we call the distal part of the arm, or like the hand, for example, or the foot, and then spread up the leg or the arm. So, for example, someone might notice that it's hard to open a bottle cap, or they can't maybe cut their nails, or they might notice that they're tripping maybe when they're running. Those are some of the first symptoms. Now, of course, those symptoms can come with many other illnesses. So I don't want to panic anybody, because often, there's a problem with the back or other reasons for it. But those are some of the first symptoms. It can also start with speech. So sometimes slurring of speech or difficulty with swallowing, but that's less common. But I would say anytime anyone had any of those symptoms, you want to see a neurologist anyhow, so that they can figure out why you're having those symptoms.
Yeah. And if somebody with that description comes and sees you or a member of your team, what are the battery of tests that are required in order to determine if this might be ALS?
The first thing is, I would say, a good clinical history and a good examination. And then we also do a test called electromyography, which is an electrodiagnostic test. It's a test where we can look at how your muscles and the nerves to the muscles are working. That test might take an hour and a half, but that will tell us if there's a problem with the muscle, with the nerve to the muscle, like the motor nerve, or maybe the back, or maybe none of those, and it has nothing to do with your nervous system. But that's one of the early tests. We might do some blood work looking for genetic changes or vitamin deficiency or hormone problems, all that can mimic ALS.
Does this disease seem to be something that has always plagued humanity, or does it seem like it came online for us at some point in time?
I think it's always plagued humanity. It's been described originally by a French neurologist, Charcot, in the 1800s. But it's come more online just with awareness, after the ice bucket challenge and other.
Yeah.
It's been here, at least to the 1800s, if not much sooner.
Yeah. Yeah. I know ALS is known commonly in the US and perhaps in the rest of the world as Lou Gehrig's disease. What do we know about what happened to him and who was that man?
Well, Lou Gehrig was one of the most famous baseball players of all time. And I think the illness bears his name because of his courage and how he shared the news with the public and how he really lived his life. He was a supreme athlete and was noticing changes in his batting skills and average. And people have written a lot about him to try to document when it actually first started. But he came public and he shared what he was going through and how he felt he was the luckiest man in the world for the career and he had and for the family and friends that he had. And so really, at least in the United States, it's known as Lou Gehrig's disease.
Yeah. He, for me, I think one of the reasons why I'm just attracted to learning more about this ailment is because of how much it scares me that, being afflicted with something like this would be, rather close to a worst case scenario for losing so many things that, we all love. I love to do on a daily basis. My understanding in doing some research for this conversation is that the understanding at this point is that in roughly 10% of the cases, it is clearly genetic, and in 90%, it's unclear or mysterious in some way about why people are developing ALS. In the non-genetic cases where this deterioration just seems to come about in a human life, what do we know, if anything, about what might be causing that onset of muscular deterioration that leads to and causes ALS?
Yeah, really good question. You're absolutely right that in 10% of people, there's a family history, a parent or grandparent, aunt, uncle had it, and there's a known gene for the most of the part that causes it. But for the majority of people with ALS, they don't have that single gene and they don't have a family history. We know a lot more than we used to know about the risk factors. I'll say that one thing that is becoming apparent is that even in the people with the sporadic form, that there is a genetic component to it. It's just more complex than one gene, one illness. It's more of what we call a polygenetic risk. So there might be many genes that you have in your body and your DNA that increase your risk for having ALS. And so they think that about 50% of the risk, the explanation for sporadic disease is actually still genetic, but it's this complex genetics. For the rest, we're still learning. So we know that there's certain things that increase your risk of getting ALS. For example, smoking increases your risk. Certain occupations are more associated with ALS, like farming or welding. There's some controversy about whether exercise is a risk factor or not. We have seen it more common in professional football players, both American football and soccer players. But none of these are big risk factors. So meaning that they maybe double your risk, but they don't increase it, 100 times. So there's clearly other things we don't know about yet in the environment that can trigger this.
And if you are somebody who is young and is attempting as best you can, given the uncertainty and the cloud of mystery that surrounds ALS, and would like to live a life as best you can to prevent the probability that this may afflict you at some point in your life, what are the few things that you might recommend considering adopting as habits or lifestyle changes that might increase the likelihood that you never have to deal with this?
Sure. I think I would give two different answers depending if you come from a family with a known gene, right, where you're in the 10%, or if you have nobody in your family with it. I think if you have a known family history, then you want to be very thoughtful about things like avoid head trauma, maybe avoid extreme athleticism, and have a healthy diet, sleep well, do all the things that we think actually keep your brain healthy. And I do think eventually we're going to have prevention trials for those people with the gene therapies to try to prevent the illness from starting in the first place. But for the other people where there's no family history, I think the chances, first of all, of you're getting ALS are very small. It's still a rare illness. But I think in general, a healthy lifestyle where you don't smoke, where you sleep well, you eat well, and you diminish stress, all those things are, they're in your control a little bit, and they're good for general brain health as well as, preventing ALS.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I know this was an idea that I heard about a couple of years ago, and I wanted to consult with you as to whether or not you think this is total pseudoscience or has been fully debunked. But it was an idea posited by a doctor who does not specialize in ALS specifically, but he's a popular writer, Gabor Mate, who I was rewatching this last night to refresh myself on exactly how he frames or how he thinks about a disease like ALS. And a claim he was making is that it commonly occurs, or nearly always occurs, in people who are often martyrs of their families, people who have a very difficult time asking for help, essentially making the argument that a strong lifestyle component is affiliated with or associated with ALS, and that it's a rebellion of the body potentially from years of self-abnegation. Now, I've read some of your work and seen some of your interviews. I don't know that I've ever heard you speak with any real certainty about that being the clear reason or anecdote for what is causing ALS. Obviously, you're a scientist, and you've already mentioned genes a couple times in this conversation. I wanted to just put that to you to get your thoughts on the power and importance of something like a life of martyrdom or a life of you or just use this word stress in its impact and its effect on the probability of somebody getting ALS in general. I just wanted to put that to you to give you an opportunity to speak to that specifically.
Thank you. I think it's an important hypothesis, but it is pretty much a hypothesis, meaning that we don't have proof that that's true. And the challenge in a rare illness to figure out the risk factors is that it's a rare illness, and you need large numbers of people to really sort out these risk factors. So I've seen people with ALS who, don't fit the definition you just described, and so I don't think it's that probably straightforward. What I believe more is that again, there probably are these set of genetic changes in somebody's body that up your risk a lot for getting ALS. And if on top of that, you have, a high stress life, or you're, an extreme athlete, you're probably tipping yourself over that way. But that there are a lot of people who don't carry that genetic background, and if they are, the martyr of the family, or they're high stress, they're not going to get ALS. It's really a complex interaction between your genetic makeup and your exposures. And I think we're going to figure this out. There's large international collaborations to follow many, many people, thousands, people with ALS, and thousands of controls to try to understand what these true risk factors are. And, but it's going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah. And I want to get into that and the research that's going on in the future. Before we do, though, I wanted to focus in on the stress component of people's lives. It's just it interests me, and I think it would interest a lot of people to kind of delve into what that means, because we're both Americans. We both, I know your resume. There's no way you've achieved what you've achieved without working your ass off. Working extremely hard often comes with a significant amount of stress. There's almost no way you can do unique and interesting things in this world without really focusing and applying yourself with a lot of effort. How do you think about stress in a healthy manner, right? I mean, your credentials are incredible. You're working at arguably the best university in the world. Have been affiliated with the best university in the world. I know there's a concept called eustress, which is the inverse of the negative connotation of stress. Eustress being a positive form of stress that is sort of taken on voluntarily by an individual rather than having it being imposed chronically from the outside. In your mind, as a doctor, as somebody who works with people who are really suffering, how do you think about an appropriate level of stress in general for someone to live a healthy life, to limit maybe their likelihood of getting something like ALS, or just to live well in general?
I think that this is a very important, like modifiable risk factor for a lot of illness is high stress, because we know that changes your hormone levels in your body and your immune system. So I'm all for people finding ways to do the things that they love, but also do it in a way that they're not stressed. And maybe that term that you stress is really important. So I kind of, the way I do it is really around like hobbies and friends. Have to have downtime where you are kind of relaxed but it's easy to say and hard to do, but I do advocate for my patients, that they do try to minimize stress. I don't think it's good for this illness or any illness. But it's something hard in our culture, because everybody's it's a culture of working hard, but you got to take time for yourself. I give advice to young medical students about that often, about, yes, you could spend 24 hours a day studying medicine, but you need to take care of yourself too, and your family, and have your downtime for your own health. Yeah.
And there have been certainly phases in my life where I've been more of a workaholic than others, but it has been just a kind of pet interest of mine to try to delve into what we know about how how chronic stress and what comes with that. You just said hormone changes and probably a lack of sleep, how that can affect you long term. In your career as a doctor and seeing patients, I don't know. As a kid, I just remember going to doctors and being treated sort of simply as someone who had symptoms, and there was very little discussion of what else is going on in your life that might be exacerbating some of these problems that you're seeing. Do you, as a doctor and your patients, when you see people who are sick, how common do you think a lifestyle that is unhealthy, and maybe chronically so, maybe enduringly so, is really at least partly responsible for the problems that you're seeing in people? I know that's a kind of complicated thing to try to figure out, most likely, but have we just kind of determined, or have people in your medical community kind of come to the conclusion that your lifestyle and things like the amount of stress in your life really do play a massive role in what could be taking decades to develop, whether that's cancer or ALS or other very serious life-threatening diseases that people might be facing?
I think the best studies are for cognition and for Alzheimer's, where there are now studies showing that you know, poor sleep, lack of exercise are all risk factors for earlier cognitive loss. And the flip is that if you sleep better and you exercise and you eat better, that can decrease your risk for Alzheimer's or cognitive. It's harder to do that in ALS because of the numbers, because of the rare. But it's not a big leap to think that those same things might help in other neurodegenerative diseases like ALS or Parkinson's. But it's almost like a new science. I mean, they've been doing it in cardiology for decades. But how do you prevent cardiac disease? It's a new field of how do you prevent brain disease. But it's coming now. There are studies in both in ALS as well as in these other neurodegenerative. How do you prevent it with good lifestyle changes? So I think it's strong enough to say it's important to start not doing it.
Yeah, totally. And I know Matthew Walker published a very popular book in the last few years, Why We Sleep. I have Alzheimer's in my family. I watched my grandmother deal with that when I was a boy. And as a doctor yourself, what are the very simple heuristics that you would give to people to, you just ticked off it's often the basics, right? It's sleeping enough, it's eating enough, it's reducing your stress level. On a more specific level, what does that look like as advice from your side? Is it 8 hours a night religiously for sleep? Is it, salads every other meal? How do you think about what the specific recommendations for a modern person probably should be to be in line with a lifestyle that is both fun, but also is living as healthily as possible? Obviously, this is related to resources and the ability to control your life, to have a degree of control over your life. But in general, how would you give advice in that area to people?
Yeah, well, I do tend to recommend that they see real experts in it, like nutritionists and stuff. But for sleep, it's usually anywhere between 7 and 8 hours of sleep, and it's good sleep, good high quality sleep. And now it's relatively easy to measure that at home in people with different smartwatches. It's exercising, if not, every other day or every day of some type of exercise. It's good for your bones. It's good for your heart. The nutrition, it's more about trying to avoid like an inflammatory diet. So, less on the carbohydrates, try to keep a BMI that's, in the healthy range, again, the 21, 23. These are all very hard things to do. So sometimes, we have people go to nutritionists or weight loss centers or people that can help them with these. And, no smoking is kind of number one. I mean, I think, most of the people we see don't actually smoke, but if someone smokes, we advise, because that we know causes a lot of illnesses.
Yeah. And you just use this word inflammation, and I want to move on to the research side of this rather quickly in the conversation. But I think this is another area that I think just in common conversation with friends who are, roughly my age, who are living in the cities that I'm living in, I know that is a topic that just gets brought up at dinner table conversations, which is the role of inflammation in disease. And I believe this is true, that last night when I was researching information for this conversation, that my understanding is that inflammation often is associated with ALS, that people who come in and are diagnosed are often experiencing a degree of inflammation. Maybe they have been for many years in their own life. I guess my first question to you would be, am I correct in making that as assertion? And second, what is the role of inflammation in, its potential to cause unwellness or disease in people? You just, I think, mentioned grain and wheat, or I know white bread is often known for causing inflammation. Again, as a kid, that was nowhere on my family's radar. That, giving me 2 bagels as I wake up in the morning and to go to school, like that was a healthy breakfast for me. Anyways, there was a lot there, but in general, how do you think about inflammation, its role in human disease in general, and what people might want to think about doing to change their lifestyle to mitigate that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I think none of this was known when either of us were growing up. So, but I think for brain diseases, so which is more what I know about, I do think inflammation is part of ALS. For example, it's part of Alzheimer's, it's part of Parkinson's. And the more inflammation people have, the faster their illness progresses. So we know that with a lot of data in ALS. And that inflammation is multifactorial. There's lots of different ways. Some of it's in the blood, that we see markers of inflammation in the blood. Some of it's in the brain, that we see inflammation in the brain. And there are lots of trials now of drugs to try to decrease inflammation to see if that might be therapeutic. In ALS, though, we don't think it's the primary cause. Yeah. And but we do think it's a driver of the progression and the driver of the speed. The best analogy I heard was from Dr. Tansey, one of our Alzheimer's researchers. He says that basically inflammation is like the wind or that blows the fire. Yeah. It didn't start it, but it spreads it.
Yeah. And what is causing in general, right? I would imagine there might be a genetic component to the effect of foods on inflamation in people. But what generally is triggering a high level of inflammation in a human individual?
Well, we know that what you eat can impact your markers of inflammation, and that's kind of this new, really a new science around. Again, carbohydrates tend to be one of the culprits for increasing inflammation in your gut and in your blood, and also your micro biome. So these are your bacteria in your gut can be impacted by what you eat, and then they can set up the inflammatory pathway. What we didn't know until recently was this real connection between the gut microbiome and brain inflammation. And I'd say we still don't know a lot about that, but that there is a link now. I think the disease that probably has the biggest link is multiple sclerosis, where they're actually doing trials now of changing your gut microbiome to try to impact what's going on in your brain. But it's a pretty new field, at least in neurology.
Yeah, to me, it's just utterly fascinating that all the interconnectedness of what you might be eating on a daily basis and its effect on your health in general. Yeah. As an aside, I know a number of years ago, I kind of got interested in the work of Wim Hof, and he had this is what triggered his interest in cold exposure. What he had his wife had been, I think, terribly depressed for many, many years and eventually committed suicide. They had like 4 children together, and he began investigating what may have been causing that in her, because to my knowledge, she hadn't always been as depressed as she was. And he became convinced that it was highly influenced by the amount of inflammation that she had in her body. And that if she had daily cold exposure, hypothetically, there's a possibility that it may have reduced some of her most severe symptoms and made it more made life more palatable and just enjoyable for her to live. Anyways, if we can, I'd love to maybe move to some of the more specific research that's going on with ALS and potential hope that you have. And I should preface this by saying, I've been interested in ALS for many, many years. Tuesdays with Morrie was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. And then a couple of months ago, I learned that my college roommate's father was battling ALS specifically, and just recently, unfortunately, died. A guy I knew very well when I was in my late teenage and early 20 years, who would come and visit us at school. And it just re-triggered an interest of mine in connecting with people like you who know so much about the future and any hope that might be available for his children or for other people that might be dealing with ALS in the future. So let's talk about the research if we can. And I know a little bit about some of the sparkles of hope that seem to be perhaps on the horizon. Let me just put that to you simply. What in your mind right now are some hopeful rays of light for areas of research that might actually help in the future?
So I am the eternal optimist. So I'll start right that. But I am really hopeful. I think we're at the cusp of finally having a couple drugs that come to market. And why I say that is because, the FDA just reviewed and approved an oral antioxidant for people with ALS. That was in May. And they're reviewing 2 other drugs now for full market approval. And in my 25 years plus in ALS, never had 3 drugs under review at the FDA in a year, let alone 1. So that's telling me that we're getting some progress and success in the trials. The other, and I can tell you a little bit about all of those, but the other hope is this used to be an illness where maybe 50, 100 people were studying it, and we'd all get together and we know each other well, and we'd moan about how we're going to get some funding. It's completely different now. It's like thousands, tens of thousands of people studying this illness all over the world. There's never enough funding, but there's a lot more than there used to be. And the progress is just like at warp speed. So I'm optimistic that there's going to continue to be breakthroughs. So having said that, I'll just back up and I'll say probably one of the most exciting things that's happened is for the genetic form of the illness, for the form that actually the very first patient I took care of had. There's a gene therapy by Biogen called tofersen. It's a gene therapy to knock down the protein that is made badly in people with that genetic form. And that's now under review at the FDA for approval. And we'll know if the FDA approves it in January of 2023 or so. Mm. So that's, and they're also, we're working on a prevention trial with that gene therapy to take people who carry the gene and are not symptomatic and see if they can prevent the illness from starting or delay it. So that is just fantastic. That took a long time. I thought that was going to happen in the 90s when the first gene was discovered, but we needed the whole technology to be developed of how to turn off genes in people and in the brain and the spinal cord. So we're here for that. But for the 90% of people who don't have the genetic form, I still think there's a lot of hope. We understand a lot more about the biology. We know there are certain proteins that are mismade and in the wrong place. We know that there's inflammation that triggers. And there's a lot of trials to try to, even combination trials to try to slow down this illness. Or maybe I'll stop there for see.
Yeah. And so maybe let's hone in on the genetic component. And I know I'd heard you say that in another interview as well, or presentation, that to you, that was the most promising opportunity essentially at this point, or for real progress. Let's say that goes as well as possible and the results are, stunning. What does that mean for the 10% of people that, are developing ALS through a genetic reason?
I think it means that one, we have to know them, right? So we have to do gene testing on everybody so we don't miss anybody who might carry that. Gene testing and people who have ALS. Yeah. Make sure we don't miss anybody with the genetic form, and that we want to start that treatment as early as possible. Before they lose a lot of function. And that's why I'm kind of excited about the prevention trial, because that's as early as you can do before they even have symptoms. But even for the people who get symptoms, you want to diagnose quickly and start the treatment quickly.
Yeah. Is it akin to, I think it's something like a BRCA2 test for breast cancer, where you can identify, women who are almost certain to develop breast cancer and take proactive measures to prevent, life-threatening development in a human being. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And those tools are now available. They're actually, low cost now as well. It's anytime you have you develop a treatment that actually works and effective, then, broad testing makes sense, right? So if you don't have a treatment, you test everybody and people know they might get an illness that you can't do anything about. That's very anxiety provoking and complex. But if there's a treatment, then it's the flip. You don't want to miss it because you want to intervene early.
Yeah. Am I correct in the 90% of cases, which is obviously the vast majority, there, there really isn't currently a way to identify. This is one of the things that's so baffling about ALS. So this is somebody for me, is its onset can just seemingly come out of nowhere. You said this earlier in the conversation that very often these are robust uh, human beings. Some of them, athletes. We've already mentioned a couple of them. Is there really no way prior to tripping over your feet while you're running, or not being able to hold a toothbrush or something like that, to know that this is coming before there are symptoms? Is that correct?
Right now there isn't. I hope that we'll develop those tools. So there's a big, really a global initiative to follow people at high risk for ALS. So people, gene carriers,
Yeah.
follow them to see what's the first change and when does it happen? Does it happen 10 years before, 5 years before symptoms? And by looking in the blood and imaging and other digital markers, with the thought that if we could figure that out in the people who are destined to get ALS, then maybe those same tools can be used in a broader population to see who might develop ALS. And again, that's useful if you have something to do about it. But I do think that we will have something to do about it. I'll give you a good example. Like in Alzheimer's, they've been doing those type of studies for a long time. They know, that 20 years before you're going to have cognitive changes, that you start to have changes on your MRI, and then in your spinal fluid. So, again, they're starting those prevention type trials. We don't have any of those tools in ALS, but we want to develop them.
I know, my understanding is that you are, the center at Mass General that you're affiliated with, that you're the medical director for. It's one of the, leading institutions or centers that is specifically designed to investigate ALS.
Yes.
What is the scope at present of the number of places like where you work that exist in the world? Because you just mentioned this earlier, that the number of researchers that are investigating ALS has seemingly gone exponential, or it certainly has increased by, seemingly like an order of magnitude. How many places are there in the world, like where you work, that are actively involved in trying to beat this thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have the exact number, but I'd say at least 30 or 40 in the world. If you look a little broader, like how many places take care of patients in a good way, then you're talking about hundreds. Like even in the US, there's 140 centers that are, taking great care of patients, offering them trials, but they don't all have, also the basic scientists and all the other depths of research. There, I think it's more the 30 to 40. But we're all working together. That's the other thing. If people go into ALS, are doing it because they want to cure this illness, and it's, I know sounds naive, but it's very true that it's a community that works together, that it's not a competitive, I want to get there first. It's like, this is awful. We need to work together so we can speed up, progress.
You've used this word you've self-applied this word earlier in the conversation, that you're an optimist. You're also a scientist. And if you think about 5, 10, 15 years from now, what's the most optimistic yet also realistic future that we could be walking into potentially, right? If the research progresses in a way that is close to a best case scenario, or is a best case scenario, and we're in the year 2032 and people are still terrified of this thing, what do you think is a realistic but optimistic future that we may be entering in terms of what the risks look like for ALS, what kind of progress we may have made for dealing with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I hope we're going to be like what multiple sclerosis is now, where we're going to have 15, 20 drugs out there, and we'll be tailoring them to different people. We'll understand more of the biology, and it'll be what I would call a livable kind of illness, a chronic illness, but not fatal in 3 years. That people will be living longer with it and better, and that we'll be working on repair. How do you return function? Because that is the next step. Like if if we can stop the progression or really slow it down, people still are not going to have full function. So can we think about how do you actually reconnect the motor nerves? How do you repair and regrow those connections? And that's not science fiction anymore. They're working on it for spinal cord injury, for stroke, and we're just starting in ALS, a few labs on it. So that would be, I think, a realistic goal, is that we're going to have a lot of therapy options. People will be living longer, and we'll be thinking about how to return function. Now, for the genetic form, I really hope in 10 years that's cured and prevented. I think that is very feasible, given the genetic revolution we're in the middle of.
I know you may not say this, but you seem to be close to the top of the field in this line of research. Who else do you look to, whether they're other centers or other doctors, and feel slightly in awe of, or that you point to and say, this is someone doing extremely interesting research, extremely promising research in general that might be inspiring or just give you hope and bolster the optimism that we've talked about?
Oh, there's so many, but I'll name a few. Obviously, my mentor, Dr. Robert Brown, who's at UMass, and he, of course, found with others the SOD1 gene and several other genes, and is working on gene therapies. But besides being a brilliant scientist, he's also my role model for how to be a physician scientist and care for people. I go to him still for every question, and. I'd say there's some really young superstars out there that are scientists, like Aaron Gittler at Stanford, and Kai Svensson at Cedars. We have the nice thing, again, about our kind of network of clinicians and scientists that work together is that we have all these amazing scientists that want to see their drugs brought to people, and they bring it to us as trialists. But those would be a few. I'd say in Europe, Leonard Vanderberg, who kind of does what I do in the U.S., is kind of lead a network of sites that work together and do trials, is also a go-to person.
Very cool.
But there's many. So thanks.
Yeah. My understanding is that in the last, I think, only few months, that the Biden administration has done some political work or legislative work to be able to fast track access to what seemed like high risk treatment options. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak about that. There was a man, we've talked about some of the names of people that are well known that have been dealing with ALS, like Gleason and obviously Lou Gehrig and Stephen Hawking, who I know we haven't talked about yet. I believe that this man's name was Brian Wallach, something like that. Mm-hmm. And he and his wife they actually met in the Obama administration when he was running for president in 2008 in New Hampshire. It seems like you may know this story, and they've been profiled on some national TV segments. And he has told his story about their goal, their primary goal, to me, seemingly being allowing patients who are really facing mortality the right to be able to access non-FDA approved treatments, to be able just to try something that might help. What did just happen with the Biden administration initiative that may be useful knowledge for people who are in circumstances like they are to seek out dangerous but potentially hopeful options for them?
They passed a legislation called Act for ALS, and yes, Brian Wallach and his wife and so many patients that they pulled together advocated for this in a way that was just awe-inspiring. And it's a bill for $100 million a year for 5 years that will support the FDA, so that the FDA has some more resources to move faster on decisions around ALS drugs and contribute to how to do things better that way. And then money for just what you said, for access to treatments for people who cannot be in trials. So sometimes people, let's say you've had the illness 5 years, or you're maybe you're on the ventilator to breathe, often you're not eligible for the current clinical trials. This bill will allow the physicians to give those same drugs to people who are maybe farther in the illness. So I think it's fantastic. It also, asks that we try to learn about the illness in people who are a little farther along when we give them these drugs. So it's also research. Hmm. They made the first call for grant applications for the first set of funds, and we're waiting all to hear. So we applied for several of the grants. I think it's really important, and I'm grateful to Brian and IMALS and their advocacy. It's very powerful. You made me think of one more thing. The big change in the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years is really the partnership with patients and their families. I mean, it was always there, and obviously we do trials together, but their voice is so strong now. And there isn't a study that we do that doesn't have a person with the illness that's part of it on the steering committee or on the design or, and on a committee advising us. And it's made what was already a very fulfilling and rewarding career, like triple so, and I think Brian and his group were part of, one of many groups that brought the community together, the patients, their families, and the researchers together in a really powerful way.
Yeah. I think that aligns very much with what you spoke about earlier, which is just the inner resolve in some of these patients to persevere and to try to be proactive and helpful as they deal with the deterioration of their physical body. For people that you just mentioned this, that they're the role that patients have been playing, and some of the media campaigns that I have seen just as a normal citizen related to ALS. If there is somebody who is watching this or listening to this that is recently diagnosed with ALS, is scared, and is in search of knowledge for help, right? We just talked about what the Wallachs did in terms of their advocacy on behalf of people with ALS. The work of of Gleason, and I think his organization, as I understood it, was basically providing kind of ready-made accessories and chairs and kind of medical equipment for individuals who are facing ALS to make their lives slightly more comfortable. What's available for people who may not have a lot of money, who are understandably just scared of what they're about to face? Where can they go? Where should they look to obtain the services that are available to them? I guess we're talking specifically in America at this point, but where would you recommend?
Yeah, there's I would say the first step is to the neurologist, so to the ALS center, because they will know all the resources locally. Yeah. So, for example, I know everything in New England. And we have an amazing group called Compassionate Care ALS that will help patients with anything they need in the home. And the ALS Association and the Muscular Dystrophy Association, they have chapters in almost all states, and they help people with ALS. But your local ALS clinic, and it is important to go to an ALS clinic where they have that expertise, will know what's available to you, regionally. I would start there. I think IMALS is a great website and resource for advocacy, and for also helping. Let's say you don't even know which clinic to go to, they can help you find like a good center near you.
I would love to talk about ALS for a brief minute, about its evolutionary role in the human species, in terms of why it is that something like this would be in existence for people in the first place. And obviously nature, it doesn't take much of delving into the reality of nature to realize that nature can be quite a cruel beast. And for seemingly no reason, just afflict species or people with a level of indifference and cruelty that, I don't think any modern ethical person would wish upon their worst enemy. If you think about ALS from an evolutionary point of view, how do you think about why it exists in the first place? Is it simply that these things exist because they exist, and there's no ultimate reason? It's just a fact of nature. How do you think about that in general?
It's a good question. I haven't been asked that one before. I think of ALS as an aging illness, to be honest, like that it's accelerated aging. We know, for example, that once someone hits 60 normally without ALS, their motor neurons, they start to lose motor neurons. And for Parkinson's, it's, they start to lose those neurons. And so there's something about the ability of our neurons to live past a certain use, I guess. And there's, some people think if we all live to 120, 130, we all get ALS. So that I think it's part of that evolution that our bodies have not been made yet, that our neurons can survive, long wear and tear. And why it's accelerated when people get sick, that's what we're trying, that's what the field's trying to figure out. So that's kind of how I think of it. If we can figure out why we age, evolutionary, then we'll figure out why people get ALS and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which are all kind of diseases of aging. Yeah,
I know he probably lives down the street from you, but David Sinclair, I think, is well known in the public for working on longevity, and there are people like him as well that have become kind of more public figures who speak about that whole issue as well. This was a question I wanted to bring up to you, and it's a rather weird one, but I'm going to set the table with this. I bring this up in part because I interviewed the man who is directing the creation of I think it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's something like the Center for Psychedelic Studies at Harvard, who worked at Mass General as the director of psychiatry at Harvard for 20 years, Jerry Rosenbaum, who you probably know him.
No, I know him well.
Yeah. Okay. So I met him at his home last summer when I was in Boston, and he was one of the first 15 people on my podcast. And, I think is obviously a credentialed and very intelligent guy. One of the big I've mentioned this many times on these episodes, but one of the things I remember from my conversation with him is that he's generally dealing with mental illnesses, and that a common thread among all mental illnesses in general is something he called rumination, and that it seemed to him like some of the preliminary trials for people who were going through, for example, psilocybin trials with chronic depression, is it seemed to lessen or decrease or even eliminate that propensity for rumination. And it's an interesting time right now, I think, in general, because of the Michael Pollan's book and the documentary that just came out called How to Change Your Mind, which is all about the history and the hope for psychedelics. And I've met people personally who have had chronic ailments like alcoholism essentially eliminated in a couple of guided sessions with professionals. I've heard anecdotes of individuals that have had all sorts of seemingly crazy chronic human problems, like severe stuttering, seemingly eliminated from a few of these trials. And very likely there is nothing there. But as somebody who is an amateur pretending to be a journalist, I think this is kind of something I like to do, is just ask weird questions. Do you regard the work that Jerry is about to embark on, work that's beginning to be taken slightly more seriously for treating, again, very serious human problems, that there might be something, an alternative form of medicine that traditionally has not been incorporated into the Western canon, that could be there, that might lessen the symptoms of ALS or decrease the rapidity of the muscular deterioration? I just wanted to put that to you because I know it's an
Yeah.
odd thing to ask in general, but how do you think about that in general, if you have it all?
Yeah, it's I'm smiling because a couple months ago, one a person I was seeing asked me if it was okay for her to take a guided trip, and it's a guided trip. What do you mean a guided trip?
Go to
but
the Bahamas.
and but it's become a more of a question that people are asking. So I think, first of all, I think we should explore it. And
Yeah.
I do think that his work in that center is doing really rigorous research so that they can understand what the drugs do, the dosing, how to see if it's working or not. And I do think that it's worth thinking about in ALS. There is a ketamine trial going on actually in ALS, and there's starting to be some science on it. I kept thinking just because something was a banned substance doesn't mean it wasn't good. I mean, we know it's psychoactive, so we know it gets in the brain and it changes transmitters. So I'd say right now there isn't a lot of data in ALS, but I think there's enough in these other fields that it would be a worthy a study worth pursuing. It's not something I'm doing personally, but I would support someone else, researching it. And I have it on my to-do list to reach out to Jerry and some of the other people in the center to talk about ALS. So this is a good reminder.
Yeah, it's kind of odd timing, but randomly about a week ago, I met. He's younger than I am, a guy that was essentially drinking himself to death, and was clearly at the end of his rope, where his family thought that he maybe had 2 years left before he would die, and that was when this is in New York City, when NYU had their preliminary psilocybin trials for people with addiction and end of life kind of existential despair, and he was able to get in to that program, and I randomly met him, and he had been featured on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper, and I didn't know who he was, and he's decided to basically dedicate the rest of his life to trying to help other people have access to this type of care. To me, this is, if you are in a situation where you are at the end of your rope. I think this is what Brian and his family were probably facing, where they had nothing to lose, and were desperate for trying anything to try to prolong his life with ALS. This is exactly what happened in Texas. I just moved to Brooklyn from Austin a couple of months ago, and the second or third person that I had on my podcast was he's a Democratic state rep from Brownsville, Texas, who by all accounts looked like a Boy Scout. This is not somebody who was involved in the counterculture, but he did know a lot of veterans, and many of whom, he knew the statistics extremely well in terms of how many people were committing suicide every year, and brought Navy SEALs and Green Berets in front of the Texas legislature. And to me, in a brilliant political move, kind of called the bluff of, a deeply conservative state on disallowing, alternative options for people to save their life and to become well. And that bill, I think it was Bill 1802 last year, passed with 85% support in one of the reddest states in the country. And so the first medical trials are starting, I think, this year or next year. Undoubtedly, I think will save people's lives. And this is some of the background of why I wanted to kind of put that to you, because for people who have nothing else, no hope left, that, maybe this could be something that could be of use.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I do think that it has to be pursued and understood. And there's lots of great places, NYU, Mass General, Hopkins, I think, has a center that are, doing rigorous research on this. So you can do it safely and understand it. I think now Texas, so that's really good.
It is. I know. I wanted to ask you this as well. I know we're getting sort of close to the end of the conversation, but in general, are there ever circumstances in which, to your knowledge, people are diagnosed with a clinical case of ALS and somehow have that reversed where they are now essentially ALS free. Does that ever happen? I know if it does, it must be extremely unusual, but in your knowledge of the disease, has that ever happened?
I do think it happens. And I'd say personally, I've seen it twice. And then there is this physician at Duke, Dr. Rick Bedlack, who is actually following people. He's called them reversals, where he gets their records and reviews. And he's, I think, followed 54 people over a long time. So it's very rare, but it does happen. The big questions are, was it ALS in the first place?
Yeah.
And if it was, then why did they get reversed? I compare it to the HIV field, where there were some people that were infected with the virus but never got ill. They could resist it, and the field studied those people and they only recently understood why that happened, and that's now leading to treatments. Because there was nature told the field how to fight off that virus. And I think nature is telling us how to fight off ALS with these natural reversals. So Dr. Bedlack is leading that research with a big team. But I think it's really important research.
Yeah. Very good. Well, one last question I want to ask you. And before I do, I just want to say, you alluded to this earlier in the conversation that, people in general, in your experience, who are working in this field are involved because they want to help. This is not necessarily a field you get involved in to boost your prestige or make a lot of money, right? It's there's clearly an altruistic aspect to people like you who have dedicated their career to helping. And I hope you obviously are correct, and that in the future, we've already made progress, it seems like, but that could be really accelerating in time, and it's going to be due to the hard work of people like yourself and your colleagues, and just personally, this is why I love doing this kind of work, to be able to meet digitally people like you who I have a lot of respect for. So thank you for the hard work. And I think I speak for a lot of people who might never meet you, and in voicing that. What I would like to close with is asking you what has motivated you to get involved in this, and what motivates you to keep doing this, right? Like, I think I mentioned this in this conversation, that my desire to talk to you in part stemmed just personally from having somebody I know who just died of this terrible disease. What inspired you in the first place to want to give the best years of your life, your intellect, your energy to go after this thing and work on this in the first place? Why this, and why was this so important to you initially and to this day, where you're leading these institutions and working as hard as you are?
Well, my inspiration started with Susan, a mom, and about my age, fighting this illness and doing it with such dignity, and then it remained inspired by the thousands of people I've taken care of. It's not a regular doctor-physician relationship, or doctor-patient relationship. We get to know our patients, our families so well and so intimately, and then even after they pass, we stay with the families. It's an honor. I mean, I feel like I've met so many amazing people in my life, and they inspire me. I have a little folder up here called my Smile File, which is letters from my patients and their families, and then if I have a down day, to read it. But then it slowly became also my colleagues, not just at Mass General, but in the community. It feels like a big effort family trying to solve a very complex problem. So I do love everything I do every day. I can't imagine doing anything else. I mean, I've also, I'll retire when we cure this illness, but I'll do something else until then.
Very good. Merritt, this has been a real pleasure to be able to do this. And again, I think I speak for many in cheering you on and wishing you the best of luck in the research and the work. And with any luck, in due time, we will make some serious additional progress with this. But thank you so much for doing this. It was a great pleasure for me.
Thank you, Dan, for doing this and for talking. I look forward to watching it and your other podcasts.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.